In Paris, the suburbs, les banlieues, evoke a word more akin to the inner city in America. The drab, concrete, high-rise housing for low-income families is located there. Crime is high, work is scarce, and young people who can't find it linger on the streets. As is in the United States too, poverty and race are often intertwined. The housing projects and halal butcher shops there are full of immigrant families, Arabic-speaking men and women, the children of migrants who came looking for work from the former French colonies in Africa. But this isn't a uniquely French phenomenon. Places just like this exist in nearly every major European city. Places like the Molenbeek quarter of Brussels, the Wildemanbuurt in Amsterdam, and Tower Hamlets in London. But segregation, many Europeans thought, was more of an American problem. I mean, Europe was always supposed to be more equal, right? Unfortunately, the urban challenge of socioeconomic segregation, which has plagued American cities for generations, is growing in Europe too. From Amsterdam to Athens, Madrid to Milan, Oslo to Vienna, this American-style divide has caused policymakers and politicians to ask whether or not European communities will turn into American-style ghettos. So have we found the limit to the generous but fraying European social safety net? Or is there still a chance that we can provide both housing and opportunity for all? Well, let's take a look. Today's video is made possible by my supporters on Patreon. If you would like to gain early access to videos before they're uploaded to YouTube, as well as participate in exclusive Q&A sessions with me, please consider supporting my channel at patreon.com/typeashton. A cornerstone of my professional and academic research is the intersection between housing, economics, and geography. We know very acutely that where someone lives is intrinsically linked to the opportunities and challenges they're likely to face. In my line of work, we call this the geography of opportunity. And this refers primarily to those structural attributes, social, economic, environmental, and cultural, of a neighborhood or larger area that affect people's life chances above and beyond just their individual characteristics. In the US, perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomenon is called the Del Mar Divide. Located in St. Louis, Missouri, the repercussions of this divide is visible along Del Mar Boulevard. We see radical differences in not only the racial makeup of the inhabitants, but also the average home values and the educational attainment levels. But that particular divide, and quite frankly, divides like it all over the United States, didn't happen overnight. The racial divide in St. Louis is a hangover from a history that we haven't fully reckoned with. It originated in the 20th century with racial segregation laws, housing covenants, and redlining. And even though these measures have been outlawed, the divide is still perpetuated through city planning, economic, educational, and societal opportunities, housing appraisals, and more. However, like I mentioned, segregation in the United States tends to stem from historical patterns that we really never fully addressed. Patterns dating back to slavery, Jim Crow, that cemented white suburbs and black inner cities. But in Europe, it's arising from more recent forces to which the continent is still struggling to respond, quite frankly. In a large study conducted by researchers across the continent, 13 cities across different regions of Europe were analyzed to understand the relationship between segregation and socioeconomic factors, as well as different degrees of globalization, inequality, welfare, housing regimes, and occupational profiles. And their findings show that segregation in Europe is on the rise and reaching US levels. It rose in Sweden, which didn't see its first major wave of immigration until the 1990s. It rose in Estonia, a Soviet country just a generation ago. And it rose in Spain, where more than 3/4 of households own their homes. Now, within academia, there's actually a pretty big debate that goes on how exactly do we measure inequality? Should we focus on income inequality or wealth inequality or both. But despite these debates, there is pretty robust consensus that social inequalities in Europe stem back much further than this particular study. In fact, in many countries, it harkens back all the way to the 1970s. And even in periods of sustained economic growth in just the last 2 decades, socioeconomic inequalities increased in several parts of Europe. In other words, the rich became richer, and existing policies and institutions were not successful in tackling poverty. Of course, more recent events have exacerbated the problem. The economic downturn and financial crisis of 2008 in particular has intensified this process, and the results have been violent. Perhaps one of the more extreme examples is that of the unrest and riots which took place in Paris, in which poorer districts on the edge of the city revolted against the capital's wealthier residents. These unrests, and those also experienced in London in 2011 and Stockholm in 2013, frequently originate from societal challenges such as unemployment, poverty, discrimination, and strained relations between minority communities and law enforcement. But it isn't the same in every city. So let's take a look at a handful of the cities from that study and take a look at more of the acute challenges. The Austrian capital of Vienna is in a special position amongst its European counterparts because it has both a high proportion of old housing stock and communal housing. More than 40,000 buildings containing over 300,000 flats in Vienna were built during the founders period of the 1890s. And with about 230,000 flats, Vienna also has the largest public housing stock in all of Europe. Here, a surprising 31% of the population lives in public sector housing, and another 30% live in subsidized housing. The municipality actually remained the most important building contractor until the 1970s, and the city of Vienna is still Europe's largest residential property owner. Typical, too, for Vienna is a policy of social equality, with the city constantly working to develop measures aimed at reducing social disparities. For example, the only requirement for assessing social housing are meeting a cap on income that is actually set so high that 75% of the population actually qualifies. And having lived in the city for just 2 years means residents tend to be from diverse backgrounds and aren't typically as segregated from one another. Yeah, okay, so you might be wondering, okay, so Ashton, then why exactly is Vienna even on this list? Well, unfortunately for Vienna, its strong social housing network on itself isn't enough to stop income segregation from happening. You see, Vienna has seen a shift in the occupational structure of its residents, in particular a striking shift in the increase in the professional, generally highly skilled labor force. Between 2001 and 2021, Vienna has seen the number of professionals triple, while demand for labor in Vienna is declining for occupations requiring intermediate and lower levels of qualification. And this is mirrored in a shifting educational structure of its residents too. The share of the workforce who graduated from university increased from 13.5% in 2001 to 38% in 2023. So although more than 60% of the city's 1.9 million inhabitants live in social or subsidized housing, you kind of have to ask, what exactly is happening to the other 40%? As Vienna's population gets wealthier and more skilled, they're likely to enter into homeownership, leaving those in the low-income groups to be the most likely to live in private rentals. And that's a problem, since Austria began rolling back its policies on rent control in private rental dwellings. In 1991, almost all private rental dwellings were rent controlled, about 93%. But by 2018, it decreased to just 63%. In 2005, prices between social and private rentals in Vienna were actually rather similar. But fast forward to 2018, and they've diverged, as landlords could now charge market value for the rent at regularly increasing intervals. Now, while rent control does guarantee pretty stable housing prices for a very large chunk of the Viennese population, the free market subsegment is becoming increasingly unaffordable. Boundaries between insiders and outsiders are redefined, forging a split between sitting tenants with old, unlimited contracts and newcomers to private rental housing that face insecure and more expensive housing conditions. And again, this tends to be pretty problematic because the vast majority of those unaffordable private renters are disproportionately held by those who reside in the low-income tier. So although tenant profiles in social housing are still very generally mixed, from a spatial point of view, we're starting to see housing neighborhoods in Vienna look a little more like American ones, where low-skilled persons increasingly live spatially separated from the rest of the population. You know, if you ask most Americans to pick a country that embodies the socialist utopian ideals of both social equity and economic stability, well, a lot of them are probably going to pick out Sweden.
Sweden.
From a housing perspective, however, Sweden had a long tradition in providing high quality and affordable housing for all. But a lot changed in the 1990s with substantial cuts to the state budget, gutting investment and residential subsidies, and liberalization trends in the housing market. As a result, much of the public housing stock was converted into private rental and cooperative housing in Stockholm, and rent subsidies for new housing construction were abolished, which allowed more freedom to market forces to shape housing allocation and new housing construction. And in this regard, a lot of what happened in Sweden and Stockholm specifically pretty much mirrored what had happened in the United States a couple of decades earlier, especially when it comes to large disinvestment in social housing and overall general market liberalization. The reduction in general subsidies has resulted in an incremental increase in rent levels as landlords gained more freedom in rent setting, with high market pressures to differentiate rent levels depending on the attractiveness of particular housing segments, especially in the private rental stock. In the owner-occupied and cooperative sectors, property prices in the Stockholm region have increased substantially, partially due to less subsidy of new construction, and partially due to an increasing overall lack of housing, and, well, also partially due to low interest rates on mortgages. But all of these things put together, affordability has decreased for all lower income categories, but particularly affecting non-Western immigrants who face major problems competing for jobs in the new Stockholm economy. You see, like I mentioned earlier in the first section of this video, segregation in Europe is a little bit different than the segregation that we've experienced in the United States. In Europe, segregation is bound up in immigration, as African American segregation in the US does not today. And religion, again, as most immigration in the US does not. Many of the North African and Turkish laborers who temporarily came for low-skilled work in Europe in the 1960s and early 70s settled in the brutalist apartment complexes that had been built as desirable workforce housing, kind of as American public housing once was. Within a decade, those projects became enclaves for low-income ethnic minorities. And a lot of them have remained that way ever since, as temporary workers began to stay permanently and many of them bringing their families over. Other European countries, like Germany and France, for example, later also became havens for asylum seekers from war-torn countries like Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Syria. But there too, refugees ended up in the cheapest housing on the outskirts of town, isolated from jobs. In Stockholm, concentrations of low-income groups have become denser, and such pockets of poverty are located mostly in and around neighborhoods that already displayed some social decline in 1990. In terms of geography, these areas largely overlap with what we call the outer city multifamily housing segment. In other words, the large housing estates dating back to the late 1960s and 70s. But I don't want to lay the blame of Stockholm's housing inequality solely at the feet of immigrants. The widening gap between the rich and the poor is creating issues in many European cities. And yes, although this tends to be more pronounced within immigrant communities and other minority communities alike, Native citizens also experience this too. The sad truth is that just like the US, the rich and the poor are living at an increasing distance from one another, and this can be disastrous for the social stability and competitive power of cities. Evidence from empirical studies illustrate in Stockholm an increasing concentration of high-income earners in the Northeast. Those who possess sufficient resources to make a free choice in the housing market have obviously chosen to live in upper middle class areas, leaving formerly more income mixed neighborhoods less mixed. And this is exactly the scenario that has befallen many American cities. Now granted, Although all white and all black neighborhoods have pretty much largely vanished since the Fair Housing Act of 1968, of all 209 metro regions in the US with more than 200,000 residents, 81% were more segregated in 2019 than they were in 1990. The city of Detroit, for example, is 80% black, while Grosse Pointe, a suburb that shares a border with the city, is 90% white. Detroit's median household income is $26,955. Grosse Pointe Park's is $101,094. And Drive Down Alta Road sums up the challenges facing the well-to-do suburb and the former industrial powerhouse. On one side of the road, the Detroit side, there's block after block of dilapidated houses and vacant lots overflowing with weeds. On the Grosse Pointe Park side, a main street leads to yoga studios, beer gardens, antique stores, and bespoke decor. And although Stockholm is not nearly as pronounced as Detroit, as its stock of housing becomes more and more privatized, low-income residents tend to seek houses in the rental-dominated area on the urban periphery. And it's exactly these kind of disparities between city and suburb that often leads to racial and ethnic tensions that linger for generations. And now, this final point is really pivotal if you want to understand the nature of segregation in both the US and in Europe, and what that's probably going to look like moving forward. Whereas concentrated poverty was the main driver of segregation in the 1970s and 1980s, more recent research finds that concentrated affluence may be a greater source of the growing levels of income segregation that accompany the rise of top incomes. While the majority of Americans and Europeans have seen their wages stagnate or fall, incomes of those at the very top have grown astronomically. In consequence, wealth has become more concentrated amongst a small group of the ultra-rich. And ultimately, economic stratification leads the rich and the poor to become segregated spatially and socially. When the gap between the rich and the poor grows into a fault line, social mobility plummets, solidarity suffers, and political divisions grow deeper. So, maybe this won't actually surprise most of you, but at least for me, I think the one thing that stuck out the most when I was researching for this video was just how much localized factors like social inequality are outweighed by universal global processes when it comes to things like segregation. In all of the 13 cities that this study examined, the most common factor characterizing highly segregated cities is the level of globalization and wage inequality. In the south of Europe, the more global cities of Madrid and Milan are more segregated than Athens, despite the fact that social inequalities are actually much higher in Athens compared to Milan. And in Western Europe, the most global city is London, and it's more segregated than Amsterdam and Vienna. So, in a way, this is actually really quite the modern urban paradox, as globalization has brought us closer together than ever before. Great barriers are also emerging between our closest neighbors. Segregation is stark in the central nodes of the international system. Global cities like New York, London, and Paris exemplify these processes. Elites in these cities work for international businesses and can afford the luxury of choice when it comes to housing. A combination of personal preferences and economic factors sort people into the neighborhoods in which they live. Meanwhile, their less privileged neighbors are marginalized in ghettos and housing estates. It's a vicious cycle that unfortunately goes part and parcel with the trend of globalization. But in Europe specifically, this trend is fed by things like a shifting economy, rising inequalities in immigration, and retreating welfare states. And quite frankly, I can see why many politicians and policymakers are becoming fearful of what this could mean. It's interesting. In French, Dutch, and German, people actually use an English word, something called no-go areas, to describe what Americans like myself might call bad neighborhoods, as if the very concept were imported from the US like fast food. When politicians in Europe talk about these no-go areas, they often refer to what they think is a US situation. Very high levels of inequality, racial inequality, and racial segregation. And I think that's the image that a lot of people have of the US, and they're fearful that that could be the direction that Europe is starting to go. So it'll be really interesting, I think, moving forward to see exactly what politicians and policymakers want to do to tackle this segregation. Because I've seen what happens in the United States. I've studied what happens in the United States, and things can get worse, and they are a lot worse in many cities. But how we tackle this exactly is a huge question. Whether you tackle it from a human perspective, or if you tackle it from a housing perspective, or if you tackle it from a planning perspective, there's really not just a one-size-fits-all approach to the solution to income inequality and spatial segregation. So I actually think this is a point in the video where I would love to hear from you down in the comment section on what your lived experience has been like in your cities. Have you seen things becoming more income segregated where you live? And if so, what do you think has really perpetuated that segregation? But if you're lucky to live in a community where you don't feel like that's the case, do you think there are some other bigger processes going on? Maybe some policy that was implemented at the local level that changed things for the better to keep things more mixed, more vibrant, and less isolated? I'd love to hear from you down in the comment section below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!